Imagine you are in a loud restaurant not of your choosing, full of noise and people, where the menu is enormous with its multitude of options. The waiter comes by often to make recommendations on some of those menu items, but doesn't often tell you why he's making these recommendations. How to choose when you are presented with so much choice, so much input as to what you should be doing. When it comes to chronic pain, knowing what to order that is going to best satisfy you and your needs can be challenging and overwhelming. Welcome to the Chronic Pain Experience podcast. I am your host, Dina Chopolis, head pain coach and chief curator at Pain to Possibilities and the Change Pain Academy. In today's episode, we will be exploring one of the most popular items on the chronic pain menu, and that is physiotherapy. I'm excited to introduce you to our guest today. Nathan Augeard is a physiotherapist in Quebec and the founder of Physio Connection, a Canadian network aiming to connect people living with pain with qualified physiotherapists. He is also a PhD candidate in rehabilitation sciences at McGill University. Nathan's research focuses on improving how physiotherapy students learn to manage pain across Canadian universities. And this is why I'm so excited to have you on my podcast. Nathan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
Great. I am excited for your message. I think this is a really timely podcast simply because there's just so much shift happening within the chronic pain world. And I really believe physiotherapists are leading the charge. Tell us a little bit about the research that you're doing.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's a really exciting time to be working as a physiotherapist and as a researcher in the pain field because so much is happening. And I'm really lucky to be part of a network of researchers that are working to improve how physiotherapy students learn to manage pain. And the idea is really to kind of provide the next generation of therapists with the skill set they need to be able to really help the people that suffer from chronic pain.
Amazing. Yes, so timely because we know that there is such a large gap, right, between our current medical model. Not to say anything negative about our current medical model, I just think that we have a little ways to go to be kind of more complete in our care. So as a physiotherapist, Nathan, what sort of gaps are you currently seeing in the medical model?
The major gap that we see as physiotherapists is passive care rather than active care. And that's mostly due to maybe the lack of training, understanding, or lack of resources.
Right.
I think so. It's not just a people problem, but a system issue.
Exactly.
And what we see is a lot of the people that have chronic pain are just dealt with, just take this medication and read this and go off. So it's really kind of passive, or something is done to them, like just get this little massage or this little manual therapy, and that's you're good to go. But we know it's a lot more complex than this. And so what we see in physiotherapy is that what we think we can do better is that we should be a lot more active with the people living with pain, together come up with something that makes sense for them so that they can take it on, make it their own, and go back to living the life they want, as a key player in this rather than a passive recipient of care.
Right. Fantastic. And that's, I think, part of the reason I wanted to use the restaurant analogy or the large menu is that there's just so much choice and not a lot of guidance. And so you summed it up perfectly there. And perfectly aligned with what you just said, one of the complaints from our chronic pain community is they feel like care is really being done to them and not with them. And so it sounds like with your research and also just your approach to physiotherapy is that you want to have them as key players at the decision-making table, right? Yeah, and I think that's really important. So how is physiotherapy really helping to address this?
Yeah, first off, I'll just add to how people, you mentioned that they often feel like it's passive, it's done to them.
Right.
But also to add to that, a lot of people don't feel listened to or understood by the healthcare providers. That's a big issue. Like that's part of the, the things that we should be working towards.
Right.
And to answer your question as to how we are working to prevent that or to improve on that, there are two different ways, one in research and then one in clinical practice. So the one in research is really about bringing people living with pain as partners in the research process rather than just participants that we do things to them and we're like, okay, this works, it doesn't.
Right.
Instead, we take them on board and work with them as colleagues and say, what would make sense for you in terms of intervention design? How can we think about this from your perspective? So having the voice of people who suffer from chronic pain in the research has been a really big shift. And we see it now in even funding applications. Say, do you have a patient partner? Do you have someone that
Right.
can tell you, the story of people that actually go through that?
Yeah.
That's really good to see that happening. And it's been fantastic on my side to work on people that have so much experience and knowledge in the field.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you're right. I love that you're incorporating both because both parties are the experts. Chronic pain patient.
Exactly.
That's part of the reason I started working with chronic pain patients is they are probably the most intuitive bunch because
Mhm.
they know so very well what's going on in their body, but may not be fully getting the full explanation around how and why it's happening. So tell me some of the stories of what I wasn't really thinking about going this way, but I'm really intrigued as to some of the powerful examples you're seeing of when you include chronic pain patients into the research process.
Mhm. That's a really good question. I think it's when you create something that actually makes sense to people that are going to use it, or
Mhm.
be recipient of it, in the sense where you create something. For example, we recently completed a profile of competencies. So it's a tool that highlights what we think physiotherapy students should be able to do by
Mhm.
the end of the training in terms of pain management.
Mhm.
And when we create this with students, educators, but also people living with pain, when we have this tool and in the end we see, okay, this is making sense to the
Mhm.
people who will ultimately benefit from the care, the improved care,
Right.
it really makes a big change. And I've had the chance to chat with a few of people living with pain who are involved in research, and
Right.
it makes such a difference, not only in their life, but in the life of millions of other people, to have
Right.
their voice listened to and validated, saying we're important. We're not just subject of research. We're part of it. We have a say in that, and that's really valuable.
One of the key players. Absolutely. I think that's fantastic. Now, do you feel like with the research that you're doing and the examples you're seeing that I think part of the frustration, regardless if you live with pain or not, is compliance. So how consistently are people doing these small exercises that have been recommended, doing the work to help them mitigate the pain? Do you feel like by bringing in people into the equation who live with chronic pain, that the compliance is starting to shift in a positive direction?
In the research that I'm involved with, there's less clinical work. It's more about
Right.
the education aspect. So I'm not sure I can
Of
really
course.
comment on that aspect.
Okay.
Um, but some of the lessons I learned in clinical practice
Yeah.
is, if you're talking about compliance, you're probably not providing things that are making sense to the person.
Mhm.
Be it because you didn't explain it well or because
Right.
it's not relevant to them. But
Right.
if they have to force themselves to do it over and over again,
Right.
then maybe it's not the most applicable thing to in their life, compared to if you were to tell them or to explain maybe it in a different way, so that it actually makes sense to them. Like, okay,
Yeah.
now I get it. I understand why I should be doing this, or why it's a good idea for me to
Right.
integrate this in my day-to-day life. So
Right.
I generally think those kind of conceptual changes have to come from within, rather
Mhm.
than just being like, oh, I do it because my physio told me to do it.
Right. Right. Well said. I think as a coach, I really appreciate that message. So thank you for bringing that out because it's true. It is
Yeah.
a lot of inner work. And I don't think our chronic pain community truly appreciates that the
Mhm.
external work they get, they live it day to day, the multitude of appointments or, understanding where to go next. It's the internal work that can be difficult sometimes.
You don't need both, of course.
Yeah.
The idea is that the external work is there to facilitate this inner work
Ex-
by providing guidance, providing, maybe the steps, highlighting what could be done.
right. Right.
But ultimately, it has to make sense for the person, at a individual level.
Absolutely. No, so well said. So I know that part of the role with physiotherapy too is really helping our community to understand the importance, but also how to move safely, because movement can be one of those scary words. They're being told you need to exercise, which of
Yeah.
course that word in itself can bring up a whole multitude of emotions. But it's also, having to deal with the fear around movement. And unfortunately, that is one of the gaps as well, is they're not necessarily being addressed how to move. So how do physiotherapists kind of, again, help to fill that gap between knowing that movement's really important to getting them to a point where they can feel a little more confidence in their
Yeah.
movement?
That is definitely a challenge, and we know that movement is so beneficial at so many levels. Not only,
Mhm.
it's healthy for the body to be moving, for your heart, your brain, and all those kind of biological aspects, but also you get to do more of the things you enjoy, seeing your friends, seeing your family,
Right.
doing this sport that you enjoy, or just going out for a walk. So movement is so key in so many aspects, and that's really the focus of our profession as physiotherapists.
Right.
But now, how do we get people to move when they have pain? And that's definitely a challenge. One of the ways that I really like to start this is by helping them understand the value of movement first. So understanding, I'm not doing this just to hurt you. I'm not doing this just because I said so. I generally think this is a really good thing for you. And we know it can help you, live a long life, but also it can help you kind of calm down the pain system that is right now quite overwhelmed and really highly sensitized. So we can, calm this down through movement. It's really the key to get back to doing the things you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to get there in the end, we need to start somewhere. So building this understanding together of, movement is making sense is the
Right.
first step. And then afterwards, it's really about finding the baseline as to what
Mm-hmm.
people can do. And so this can be for people that have this kind of what we call the boom bust cycle, where they do
Right.
a lot in one go really high up, and they don't do
Yes.
anything for a few days and then start again. Organizing this, I'm like, okay, what is the minimum I can do
Mm-hmm.
that does not have this flare afterwards?
Right.
And you can start with a simple movement like walking, something that you already do. It doesn't have to be something highly complex. We can get there in the end, but let's start slow. Let's start easy.
Yeah.
And once you have this idea of baseline, you can then progress slowly over time.
Right.
And so that's really one of the core principles of movement in physiotherapy. When you have chronic pain, is this idea of graded exposure to movement or even to feared movements. If you
Right.
fear to do a specific movement, can we break it down into small steps and then go
Right.
up one step at a time?
Right.
So that's really how I try to help my patients. And I think how evidence-based pain physiotherapists are doing it is by building an understanding of the value of movement and then
Right.
kind of implementing this into a graded exposure to it.
Right. Which there's so much here that we can talk about. So let's spend a little time here because I know that there are going to be lots of questions from our listeners. I love the fact that you're saying that, and I firmly believe this myself, and that's why I do what I do. I believe that it's really important to build that context up first
Yeah.
to really get an understanding of the why, the how, so that they have that investment up front. So I know physiotherapists are really, really good at that and also leading the charge when it comes to care. It also leans into the whole premise around how pain is the biological, the psychological, and the social. For our listeners, everything to do with chronic pain, even chronic illness, is always biological, psychological, and social in nature. And so, Nathan, you touched on those beautifully, how, when we talk about movement, we also talk about fear of movement. So it's the physical as well as the emotional. And movement has so many emotional context to it. So just like we do with anyone who is experiencing anxiety, is that gradual graded exposure. Thank you. Yeah, to whatever it is that you're doing. Those are really key concepts to keep in mind for our listeners, is that it can be done and it will hurt right up front when they're just starting to move. It will inevitably hurt. However, when you have that contextual background like you're offering them, then they will understand that it is for the best, and this is why it's happening, and it will start to change as your movement starts to increase. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that any change will require some discomfort. I'm not sure it has to hurt like physically for the
Right.
movement aspect. I think will definitely be going beyond your comfort zone. And
That's a
that's
better way to put it. Yeah.
that's how I would put it generally. So some people might have, a bit of a rougher time, but I wouldn't expect to have a big flare up in pain. Just like
Right.
a good, if you find a baseline,
Yeah.
then ideally you would stay in this kind of a lower zone. It might happen, you might have flare up here and there,
Right.
and that's part of the process. But
Right.
yeah, that's how I would frame it.
That's actually good clarification. Thank you. I appreciate that. I also just want to mention too that it's really important that the research is showing that it's not just movement, it's meaningful movement. I mean, movement's important, but if we're really struggling to move, then finding something that's meaningful just has that much more impact for sure. So like you mentioned, a small walk or coupling it with people you love, doing something with people. So,
Definitely.
yeah.
I think that's, for me, perhaps the biggest element of person-centered care is really making sense in your treatment. So it's not just saying, oh, we're going to pick, let's do 10 push-ups and then 5
Right.
minutes walks. It doesn't make sense to most people. And it's the same for education about pain.
Yeah.
If you just start talking about neurophysiology and stuff like this, it doesn't make sense to the person in front of you. So it really has to be based on what is important to this person. And
Mhm.
really by listening and understanding, where do they come from? What is important to them? Then
Right.
we can really start together, build a treatment plan that makes sense. If they hate walking. I'm not going to put walking in the treatment plan, even though I
Yes.
think it might be a good way to start,
Right.
in general. Let's see what they already do. Actually, I
Yeah.
like cycling on my bike at home.
Right.
Just do 5 minutes. Great, let's start with that. So
Yeah.
really finding things that are meaningful to them,
Mhm.
in terms of treatment, in terms of goals, will really make a big difference, I think.
I know you touched on the whole boomer bust cycle as well. It can be one of those topics when you say the word pacing, which is another word for it. And I know the community, sometimes there's going to be those who believe that it's been a real lifesaver for them, and there'll be those who have no idea what it is. And then if you start to explain it, then there's that the fear comes in around what it is. So and again, I think you probably answered the question already, but
Mm.
just explain to our listeners how you would address someone. If someone comes into you and says, well, my doctor said I should be pacing, I don't know what that means, and how do I go about doing it?
Yeah, I think there are also a lot of misconceptions about pacing. So pacing is really about kind of breaking down one big activity into smaller bits, small steps, and they don't have to be carried out in the same day as well. So this idea of really kind of spacing it out into smaller, more manageable chunks is the core idea of pacing.
Right.
Um, but often, for some people, it sounds like a death sentence. Oh,
Mhm.
I'm gonna be stuck doing that for the rest of my life.
Mhm.
And that's really unfortunate because it's not true. That's not the idea behind it.
Right.
The idea is that it's temporary and it's something that we need right now to calm the system down and
Right.
then build back up. So
Right.
it might be a bit longer than they would like to.
Yeah.
It might be, a bit more challenging to, refrain yourself from doing too much. But
Hmm.
ultimately, we know that this is the best way to get back to doing the things we want to do, to build up slowly over time.
Right.
Um, and that's the same way, we think about it in the context of chronic pain, but any kind of sports where you will have to train, you need to
Yes.
have this, you can't just go hard all the time.
Right.
You're not going
Right.
to get better like this. You
Right.
need, you need to have a structured way to go about it,
Right.
taking it slow and looking for long-term progress. And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things that is missing is this aspect of this is not forever.
Hmm.
Okay, it's a step to get there, but it's not going
Yes.
to last forever.
Right.
And then the other element is about making sense of the movements, including
Yeah.
pacing. A lot of people are like, why should I pace walking when I hate walking? But let's do something else and let's pace
Right.
something. So it's really about tying back to what I was saying, making it about the person and making sure it makes sense to them.
Right. When it comes to physiotherapy, and one of the roles I see is really being important for bridging the gap between sort of the current physician care and self-care management that the chronic pain warriors can do is, again, along the lines of movement, is when they've come home with scan results, and which we'll talk about in a moment in more depth, but they've heard that there's this going on, they have this diagnosis, and there obviously is a lot of fear around what their future holds for them. I think one of the things I really see as physiotherapy being helpful for is the assessments that you can do along with the context and the, hey, this is why we're doing it,
Mm.
to be able to show them that some of these scans are not necessarily as bad as they may sound like they are coming across as. So,
Mm.
how, as a physiotherapist, do you guys sort of pull those two together?
Yeah. So perhaps I'll start with by taking a step back and kind of explaining how we shifted our understanding of pain and what does that mean for scans versus what
Right.
we do as physiotherapists. So we initially thought that pain equals damage. So if there's a lot of damage, there's a lot of pain.
Right.
But then we started to realize it's not as simple as that. If we think about a paper cut, it's tiny, but it hurts a lot.
Mhm.
Um, so there are a lot of examples like this. We're like, okay, so there's a lot of pain, not a lot of damage, or there's no pain but a lot of damage. How do we kind of make sense of this?
Right.
And we realize that pain is an experience that is a lot more complex than just damage, just what's happening in the
Mhm.
body. As any experience, the emotions is going to play a role. Your biology that you're not even aware of is going to play a role. Your context, your
Right.
understanding, all these are going to factor in.
Mhm.
Um, so that kind of brings us to the scans, where initially you thought scans equals damage equals pain.
Mhm.
Um, but now we realize, first of all, that a lot of people that are fully healthy, that have no pain whatsoever, that probably won't have pain, you should have those scans that show damage, and I say damage between quotation mark, that mean that people should have pain between quotation mark. But that's not true. We know it's only part of the picture. Pain is a lot more complex than this, and you have a lot of people that don't have pain despite having those changes. So it's not really helpful unless it's showing something really major. So if you have, broken bone, scans are really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a major tear, that's really helpful.
Right.
But in most cases, knowing that you have a disc bulge or a little tear here and there is
Mm-hmm.
not really helpful because it doesn't tell us much about your experience, first of all, but
Mm-hmm.
also about what we can do. And this is where physiotherapy comes into play. Is really this idea of let's look at what we can do based on what you can do already. So by doing the test, we can really assess how your joints are moving, how you're doing, how you're feeling about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then based on that, we can, build a movement plan based on what we're seeing. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a better kind of representation of your abilities than a scan.
Right.
And an example, I think the terms that I use as well are quite detrimental. So think about one of the terms that I use would be a tear for tendon around the shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the issue is that we have this idea of a rope that that is taut, and then you have a little tear in that, and it's going to grow over time if you put tension on it.
Right.
But that's not really an accurate representation. It's
Mm-hmm.
more like a blanket where you might have a little hole in it, but you
Mm-hmm.
might pull the blanket. It doesn't mean it's going to tear because it's
Ah,
it's really strong.
right.
Um, so it's not that helpful to have those terms there. I think having a look at, from physiotherapy, understanding what are things you can do and let's build on that is
Right.
a better way to go about that.
Right. Oh, so well said. And I love the analogy of the rope and the blanket because it's true. I think that's also one of the gaps being filled beautifully by you guys and by pain coaches and educators is that our medical system doesn't have the luxury of time to be able to explain these things, and I think it's really important to have that context. Of course, there's going to be fear. If you see an image where there's a tear, you hear the word, you smell the clinical smells around you when you're getting that diagnosis, and the look on the doctor's face. It all adds up, which touches on what you mentioned earlier about context and how it all matters. I think we need to find the balance between overdoing it, underdoing. Obviously, scans are really important for finding things that need immediate attention, something that has damage to the tissues. I know the difficult part is for our community, and please, if you have any clarification on this, I'd love to get it from you. But acute and chronic pain, acute pain being, of course, the damage to the tissues, the sort of short term. And then there's the chronic stage, which, of course, is so much different than acute. The challenge is they both feel very much the same. And so that's where it's really easy, right, for the community to feel like, I've done more damage because I feel that pain.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really a challenge for day-to-day people that might not have a detailed understanding of the human body, like physiotherapists, that have this additional training. So I don't understand how it can be confusing around this. So the way I think about it is that acute pain is really um, driven primarily by the damage, the injury. When you
Mm-hmm.
break a leg, you expect to have pain,
Right.
and you most likely will. So that's kind of this idea of acute pain that is primarily driven by the damage.
Right.
Chronic pain is when we think that damage is a lot less likely to play a role in that. So it means that it's driven by other things like hypersensitivity of the
Right.
system, or a bunch of other factors or
Yeah.
combination thereof.
Mm-hmm.
How do we make the difference though? And that's the key question.
Right.
And it's really anchored in our clinical reasoning, where we have a good understanding of how long the body takes to heal. Usually, we know the body is amazing at healing. It's
Right.
really one of the things it does best.
Yeah.
So we are quite confident, based on our knowledge of timescales for healing, that
Mm-hmm.
if you had a broken bone and you still have pain 2 years after,
Mm-hmm.
it's really unlikely to still be the bone. Especially, if you had an X-ray that showed actually the scan is showing the bone is straight, everything is doing good. So
Yep.
based on that, based on this combination of factors, and
Mm-hmm.
also combined with the tests that we do
Mm-hmm.
as physiotherapists, we're like, okay, we check this, this, and that. So I'm quite confident that the primary issue is not the damage anymore, but it's a bunch of other things. And that doesn't mean your pain is not real or you're making it up. Your pain
Right.
is real, trust me on that.
Right. Right.
But it just means that it's more likely to be driven by something else than
Right.
the damage. This might be hard to understand, but it really opens up the door for better treatments. Because if you focus on my leg is broken still or my
Yeah.
back is out,
Right.
but actually that's not the main driver, then you might be still doing things that are not helping what is the main driver. It could be
Right.
hypersensitivity.
Right.
Um, so this really having this understanding is key, and this is why it's important to have healthcare professionals that know about this stuff
Mm-hmm.
help you through that if you don't yourself have this knowledge,
Yeah.
and then orient yourself towards treatment that target those factors better.
One of the things you mentioned that I think is really important is obviously we talked about context. When it comes to chronic pain, this is a big topic we could spend a whole other hour on, that really everything matters when it comes to chronic pain and illness. But one thing that I know is really important, and I know you are probably doing a ton of work around this on your research, is that words matter. And I know you are really good at reframing, and you are really good at picking the words that are a little less scary, far more empowering in the sense that you do have more control in your court. So, with your research, or even in your practice, how important are the words that practitioners are using in our chronic pain experience?
Yeah, it's really important.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned, context is king in any experience that you feel.
Right.
If you think about just to give a little example, you think about someone touching your thigh, and this is your partner, it's gonna feel quite different than if it's a stranger on a bus. But it's the same thing, but the context is so different.
Mhm.
Um, so that is to say that the context is really important, and words are part of what you understand,
Right.
and are really part of this context. So if I tell you a word and you understand something extremely scary, like if I say tear, but in my mind it's like, oh, no big deal, just a little tear, you know? But in your mind, if you tear, this is the beginning of the end. I'm gonna tear away my shoulder. And this is really dramatic in how you're gonna perceive your injury and what you're gonna do about that, but
Right.
also subconsciously, how it's gonna make you more aware of it, more hyper focus on it. So
Mhm.
it's really important to make sure that you're using words that are, first of all, making sense to the person of you,
Right.
that not you know, not making it worse. And that can be quite challenging because you never know what someone might or might not understand.
Right.
So the way I go about it is, first of all, try to be accurate
Hmm.
and try to explain as much as possible about the words that I think could be misunderstood.
Right.
Um, so by accurate, I mean that saying things like your back is out or you have 80 years old knees is
Yes.
not accurate,
Right.
is not helpful on its own.
Right.
So in my mind, it might just be, oh, it looks like you have some changes that are linked with, all the population. That's fine in my mind, but it's misinterpreted and not helpful. So I would refrain from using words like this.
Yes.
But instead, I would change, I would say you have changes there. And then rather than just leave it at that, say, what can we do about it?
Right.
This kind of gives me the opportunity to explain by changing. I mean, this looks like you haven't moved in a while, and therefore it would be good to move because the
Yeah.
body likes movement. It's going to make this better. It's going to help with that.
Right.
So really using words that offer the opportunity to build on, to explain, and offer like a direction
Right.
is really something that I try to do in my practice and I think should be done more.
Absolutely. Oh, well said. Two really important things come from that. So, when we were talking earlier about hypersensitivity and where chronic pain often comes from, this nervous system over activeness, is words. Nothing like the initial sound of 80-year-old knees or a tear alarming the systems. I mean, our pain is meant as an alarm system, but with that hypersensitivity, it becomes hyper aroused. And so, one simple word, one
Mhm.
simple image, like you mentioned, is really going to heighten that
Mhm.
sensitivity. So that's important to remember. And then the other thing too is, as you also alluded to, is that if we know that it's coming from a place of hypersensitivity, the safety is really important. And I think that's what you are doing beautifully, is offering that nervous system a sense of safety by reframing things, by offering words that are much more comforting and powerful with a direction forward.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
cannot emphasize enough the importance of safety. And so I'm really excited that your research is helping
Mhm.
ultimately the chronic pain community, but also those who service them. As far as people who may be listening to this at home, if they've not been given the direction to go see a physiotherapist, but they have been told to move more, is there anything that you would recommend that they can just get started with?
Yeah, so the first thing the first message is that there's hope. And so a lot of people that have chronic pain, rightly so, feel that there's no hope. There's nothing moving forward. They probably have seen a lot of different providers and not sure how to move forward. But the science is clear that there's hope. Things can change and the systems can adapt both ways.
Yeah.
Um, so with that in mind, I would encourage people to have a good look at what they're already doing
Yeah.
and understanding, am I trying to really understand, is there a trajectory overall in what they're doing? Is this, a boom bust cycle? Is
Mhm.
it I'm going to avoid pain and
Mhm.
therefore I'm going to do less and less and less?
Mhm.
And once you organize this, you can start thinking, okay, now that I know where I'm at, what am I already doing? Let's try to
Mhm.
understand this. Okay, if you're already
Mhm.
working, and it's not making a big difference either way,
Yeah.
that's a very good starting point. You're like, okay, I know I can do this and
Mhm.
not have a huge flare up. Let's
Mhm.
start there. And then
Right.
let's try to, bring it up a bit, week on week. Let's try to increase a bit. And it's really about finding what I call the Goldilocks zone. So not too hard, not too easy, not too painful, not too neutral. It's really
Right.
about finding something that you can do, you can manage, that
Yeah.
doesn't seem to be creating huge flare-ups.
Mhm.
And then kind of keeping this and then increasing it slowly over time.
Right.
So this is like the general principle that what we do in treatment. And the
Right.
reason why you might still want to see a physiotherapist that knows about that is that we really have this kind of expertise to tweak it, to really make sense of it together. Because sometimes it's really hard to look at it and be like, oh, this is why I had a flare up there, or this is why it didn't progress as needed.
Right.
The overall concept is quite simple. It's simple but not easy. So give it a try.
Mhm.
See what you can do already by yourself. And then if you're still stuck, I encourage you to reach out to
Right.
people that have this understanding of pain that can answer questions like, how do I know if my pain system is being overprotective? What
Right.
can I do to calm this hypersensitive system?
Right.
How do I know if I'm safe to move? So all these questions that are um, need to have clear and useful answers. And if you
Mhm.
don't have a good answer there, maybe they don't know as much as about pain as they should. So it's really about finding and building the right team around you once you want to get to this next step.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, the more we can educate, the more we can share how the importance of our chronic pain community being at the table, the decision-making table is important. And I think what makes me so sad is I'm in a lot of chronic pain Facebook groups, really seeing what life is like with chronic pain on a day-to-day basis. I'm intermittent pain. I'm not always in chronic pain, but it just makes me so sad that there is this real helplessness and lack of hope. And so thank you for wrapping this up. We're almost done with the word of hope, because I think it's really important to message. Just before we talk a little bit more about what you're doing, strategies for flare-ups, I think, are really important, because before you have a flare-up, you have a sense of what you're able to do to help mitigate the pain when you are in a flare-up. Any advice you have for our listeners around what they can do with a flare-up?
Yeah. So I think there are two broad categories of things to do. The first one is during the flare-up, and
Mhm.
then the second one is around the flare-up.
Mhm.
So when you're in the middle of a flare-up, I think it's about finding the things that help you kind of calm down a bit. It sounds quite easy, or just find something that works, but it's true because it's really personal. What makes you feel better? It might just be lying down with, a wet towel on your face. It might be having a tea or seeing some friends. So
Right.
it's really about finding the things that work to kind of make it a bit easier, but
Mhm.
also remembering that this is not forever. Like it sucks. Don't get me wrong, it's horrible right now,
Yeah.
but it's not forever. So
Right.
this flare up will pass.
Right.
So that's I think that's really important in the middle of the flare up.
Mhm.
Now around, I think what could be really useful is kind of trying to keep track of what you've been doing,
Mhm.
because it's easy to think back and trying to make sense of things. But then you realize, oh, I forgot about this and that. And so
Right.
having some kind of log of saying, actually, I did this much activity, and I had this big stressor in my life. I didn't sleep well, or I had this big exam coming up. All these factors, when combined, can lead to a flare up. So if you can kind of keep track and say, actually, I walked 4 times more
Yeah.
than the last few days on
Right.
that day, just before my flare up. Maybe there's a link. So using that as a tool to kind of reflect and then plan for the next one, saying, okay, let's try to keep the same activity level for longer this time.
Right.
It's going to help to kind of mitigate the flare-ups. And over time, this should not only reduce in intensity, but also in frequency until
Right.
you probably don't have any anymore.
Right. Oh, fantastic message. I think one of the main points out of what you just talked about, which I love so much, is that we are really encouraging our community to become much more curious in their pain, much more observatory, like really watching their pain from sort of a higher level. So what was it that created, that intensity in pain, and what was I feeling, and so I think the more people understand that it is contextual, and that to observe what was surrounding it is a really powerful tool takes practice, obviously, and it takes time. But I think, yeah, that's a beautiful combination.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Nathan, is there anything else that we may have missed other than we'll get to how we can reach you in a moment, but is there anything else based on what we've talked about that you wanted to add to the conversation?
Not that I can think of. I really, really want to emphasize that pain is real,
Yeah.
that your pain is valid,
Right.
and that you should really look for people that have this understanding of pain, to help you build on this hope that there's a better future for you.
Right. Oh, and thank you. That was the one thing I wanted to address. Really important for our people to understand, to seek out those who are informed in chronic pain. And if you are living with unresolved trauma, then to seek out someone who is also well-spoken in trauma as well. So, Nathan, how can people get a hold of you if they would like to reach out to you?
Yeah, so the easiest way is really to go through Physio Connection.
Okay.
So we have an Instagram and a Twitter account,
Mhm.
where we publish quite frequently, at least once a week, some content about chronic pain management. So even if you're just interested in having a look at, what are the things, the message that we share, and just want to learn a bit more about pain management,
Right.
that's the best place to find me.
I think it's important for people to understand that they have choice and that they have hope. Nathan, thank you so, so much for being a part of this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Hey there. Thanks so much for being here and for listening in. By you being here today, it states loud and clear that you are either curious about learning more about your pain, or you are ready to truly shift and become the expert on your pain. Either way, we've opened the doors to the Change Pain Academy. The Academy is a space to radically shift your understanding of pain so that you can be one of the key stakeholders at the decision-making table for your chronic pain care. The space is also to support you as you implement new skill sets and behaviors to change the pain so that you can get back to a life well lived. And the best part? We do all of this inside an incredibly supportive community where we learn, grow, and celebrate wins together. It's a community for warriors by warriors. For more information, go to pain2possibilities.com.